everybody. My name's Patrick Coughlin. I'm the co-founder of TruSTAR Technology. Today I'm joined by Scott Register, who's the VP of Product Management for Cloud and Security Products at Keysight. I'm joined by Simon Thorpe, who's the product guy at Twilio. I'm joined by Jackson Shaw, who's the VP of Product Management at One Identity, and Brad Bell, who's the CIO at Infoblox. Today we're going to be talking about securing the perimeter. So I figured here we are at RSA. I don't know if any of you had the chance to walk the floor today, and if that made you feel a little sick to your stomach.
I got my
maybe.
steps in.
Yeah, I did. 14,000.
Yeah. But you know, there's a lot of companies out there talking about the perimeter. How do we do perimeter defenses differently today? So maybe we start with you, Scott. What's changed about the perimeter in the last few years?
Sure. I mean, I think for a couple of years we thought about the perimeter getting larger, right? You know, it was this well-contained data center, and then it spread out. And now, really, it's getting smaller because now we really have to think about perimeters being around individual things, whether that's users or devices or cloud instances, whatever. It's not a big circle you draw around things. It's little bitty ones around each individual element.
Yeah, that's interesting. Brad, at Infoblox, do you see dramatic evolutions in the way you guys think about talking to your customers about the perimeter and how to secure the perimeter?
I agree with you completely. I don't think the traditional definition of perimeter exists anymore. With IoT, the creation of everybody going everywhere, mobility, there's not this hard core that we used to think about, which I think was a false sense of security, actually. I think we're forced now to think about it in a much more granular way.
Yeah. And if the perimeter is evolving, how has the user's desire for the trade-off of security and convenience evolved as well? Maybe Jackson at One Identity there, you can shed some light on that.
I mean, one thing for sure I believe is it's kind of like when the wall came down. There is no perimeter anymore. And we're all stuck in this situation where the threats are coming from every direction. And part of I think our biggest problem as security professionals is the fact that every time you enable anything for security, you're typically making it harder for the end user, our customer. So I'm really big at trying to figure out how can we still have our wall, in quotes, but not make it inconvenient for our customers. And that's a huge trade-off. I mean, every day, all of us are seeing this internally with phishing attempts, with cyber attacks, with people going after accounts. It's just hard to protect everything at once, and that's kind of what we're being forced into.
Yeah. Simon, I'm curious, when you think about users or customers and how their desire for convenience or a user's desire for anonymity, and how does that balance with your ability to deliver security to them when they may want to be more anonymous?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Everybody's agreeing there's no perimeter. So essentially, we go back 50 years, you walked into a building, you walked up to a computer that was on the network in that building, and you knew that the people in the building were trusted to use those computers to a degree. Now, it's like the internet is like a crowd of people, and you're the service, and somebody just walks up and goes, oh, I want to access your service. In what building, on what network? So the perimeter really is the user, and so you're now saying that, how do we balance the information we get from a user based on that fact? Because a service wants to say, I don't know anything about you because you're no longer in a place that I trust. You're not within a perimeter that I can define. So I need to know more and more about who you are so I can protect your access to the thing you get access to. And now we've got this really weird contention where a user comes up to you and says, here's my bank account, keep my money safe.
Yeah.
I don't really want you to know much about me, where I am, what I'm doing, or what I'm on, but make sure everything's safe. But if I don't know anything about you, how do I differentiate between you and all these thousands of people just littered all over the place who are coming to the same service and look exactly the same? That's a big challenge. And how do we address that? That's the fine line that all of us are walking, right?
Yeah.
How do we collect information, store it, secure it, use it, but also satisfy the users, hey, stop taking all this information or asking me for all this information every time I come to you.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
If the user is the perimeter, which I completely agree with you on, that's a great way to look at it. We're in this situation that in most companies, then the users become the weak link. right? And which we all know, right? So it's that one user
they haven't become. They've always been. But we relied on a castle.
Well, we used to have the wall and the wall side. Yeah. So the big issue in my mind is that is now our weakest link, our weakest chink, right?
Yeah.
And it's a huge burden for us.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you have any doubt about the impact of sort of the user preference, look at iPhone versus BlackBerry, right? Who won, right? You know, for a while, companies trying to say, oh no, you got to use this managed device.
Right.
Oh no, that's all done, right? And that was the end, I think, of that argument. When's the last time you heard the phrase BYOD? Like no one says it because it's just an assumption. It is everything on the network.
Yeah. No,
and you're right. I think it is everything. It's not just people. With IoT, it's devices.
Yeah,
if you look at my home, there's probably 80 different addressable devices.
Yeah.
You know, from TVs to printers to even wall switches now. And you may not have direct interaction with that, but they do represent a potential threat vector.
Just on that point, an interesting thing that I noticed was I put a commercial firewall at home, let it sit there for 3 months, and ran a traffic analysis report. At the end of 3 months, 8% of my traffic was going to China.
Oh, interesting.
And I'm like, well, I'm not ordering Chinese food from that far away, you know. So it is true that it's not just a threat within companies, but it's a threat in our homes also.
Yeah.
I believe.
Absolutely.
So do you see? I mean, you mentioned the threat. Do you see attackers evolving their tactics, techniques, and procedures to take advantage of the fact that the perimeter has moved or dissipated? And if so, how?
Yes.
Attackers evolve their advantage. They're way ahead.
Yeah.
Like they are way ahead. And I don't just mean like they're way ahead of our technology. They are way ahead of social engineering, of cracks and holes and speed to get back onto any particular, a 0 day just pops and you are inundated. Like look at the big tech companies. I won't go through the names, but the big tech companies, and even they're still getting hammered with 0 day vulnerabilities that they just can't move quickly enough because they're such big organizations, and the agility and speed of I mean, we all kind of group this hackers together, but it really is this massive diverse group of well-funded organizations that are making billions of dollars out of basically the weaknesses in the design of the internet. And vendors like ourselves who are kind of running around building technology and addressing pieces of this, it's really the infrastructure that we've been dealt with that we're trying to cover up. Right? We're trying to figure out how does this anonymous internet that was from day one designed where, if you look at the HTTP protocols, if you look at most application protocols, authentication is always kind of an afterthought.
Yeah.
Oh, and we need to authenticate the user, and we're still using a password for the vast majority of authentications.
Yeah.
One of the things I noticed that we were talking about, or we were going to talk about, was Face ID. Has the iPhone X suddenly unlocked biometric? Oh, biometrics are the solution. All it's doing is unlocking a locally stored password.
Yeah.
It's not actually giving you a true biometric authentication back to the service. It's just local to the device.
So that's right. I mean, you mentioned password. So how do we kill off the password? Brad or others? I don't know if you have.
I'm still a fan of RSA. I think you're right. If you look at biometric information, there's a digitization that happens, whether it's fingerprint technology, facial recognition, retinal scan. It's still stored somewhere. And that is a lot harder to change than a password or a certificate. So, yeah, it's more convenient. Right. But I think one of you had mentioned the balance between what's secure and what's convenient.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but if it's stored on my iPhone, wherever my iPhone is,
I stole it
at the bar,
and now I'm logging into a China.
But to me at least that's putting the control in my hands, as opposed to having it somewhere else, and that's important to me.
But I think one of the things that comes out of this passwords are weak, biometric. All it does is unlock that phone. If you think about fast forward a couple of years. Hey, it's easy to do a total genome analysis on someone from which you could engineer a fingerprint, right? I mean, if you think forward a little, that's where why some of the machine learning, behavioral stuff gets really interesting now, because now you've got enough power that you can really detect at a very subtle level things which you don't expect to happen. Now, that's not always prevention, but at least it can limit the damage, right? Oh, this is really weird. The first transaction went through, but maybe I can stop the rest. I mean, credit card companies typically lead the way. They always have, right? Because they're on the hook for those losses. But that's a really great place for that kind of innovation. Right?
I think you're right about AI in general. It's going to be the one and only thing that we can count on to defense at scale, because the democratization of these utility-like functions to the bad side, if you will.
Right.
You've got threat actors who have a kit. Yeah. They can go act on anything they want based on that kit, so they're getting smart about the use of technology in those threats. And I think really the application of AI in the cloud, the control plane that influences edge and devices and components and allows them to sort of self-heal, what we used to call back in the day as autonomic networking, is really coming back into style with the resolution of machine learning being applied to those things. I think that's the way to go.
But going back to your privacy issue, machine learning, AI, all of these things need data about the users.
Yes.
Like, you can't have a really good authentication system that uses machine learning, buzzword, if you don't fill it full of data to tell it what to figure out. And we keep coming back to this problem. I mean, you're in the enterprise world, I'm kind of a lot in the consumer world. And in the enterprise world, there's more trust. I go to my company and I trust them that I'm giving them data. You know, I signed a contract, they ask me my date of birth, they ask me all this information, they give me a badge. And even in that world, it's difficult to kind of have employees trust you're dealing with the information appropriately, but you've got all these professionals that are looking after that data and a big IT firm. You go to a consumer startup of 10 people in the Silicon Valley who suddenly launch an app with millions of users. That's a different game totally. How do we gather all that information, stick it into our machine learning algorithm, go, oh, we're going to better protect you. The user turns around and goes, Facebook can't protect it. How are we going to you? You know, it's a difficult challenge.
So are you saying, you're saying there's a trade-off between security and privacy, which I'm not sure. And the user, because the user is demanding more privacy or an ownership of their data, right? It makes it harder for security providers to do their job in the traditional way, right? Which is to authenticate and verify, right?
So, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I mean, my question was going to be, what technologies? I mean, you mentioned biometrics and other things. You mentioned machine learning, but you know, how do we bring these? What are the applications of these technologies that are going to help us bridge the gap in these trade-offs? Or how are you thinking about that?
Well, so I mean, it's something we've been talking about for a long time. I think a part is not technology. To the extent that we can, user education is a piece of making people aware. Like even, I think on Facebook, when I see people circulate the little things, you know, what's your stripper name, your first, say, okay, this question that you just answered.
That was the first one you came up with.
I don't know why. You know what? So how the questions that you answered for that, you know, your pet, the street you grew up on, how many times was that also like a security question for a password reset? So don't answer those, right? So part of it is user education at that level, and then explaining to people the trade-offs. I mean, it doesn't go 100% of the way, but it is, especially those of us kind of in the security industry, making sure that as much as we can, users kind of understand what they're giving up and what they might gain by even giving up some privacy for security. Right?
Yeah.
If you've got a smart home thermostat, that thing knows when you're traveling.
Right.
So if there's some option to tie that to your travel app so that, you know, it knows, oh, you're out of town, and maybe hide some information, or if you're gone for more than 3 days, make the thermostat behave like you're home so it seems like you're home. So you know, that kind of thing. So if people understand what they're giving up or what they're gaining in return for some information, that helps.
I have to ask you though, what is your stripper name?
Save that for after the panel. But yeah, you, Simon, you looked like you
sorry,
were getting,
I was itching there because
you were getting twitchy and wanted to say something. Yeah.
Keep clothes on. So.
He's thinking candy.
Yeah.
He's knocking it out of his head.
So your question was, so what's the solution? What's the technology? Where do we go?
Yeah.
Right.
There isn't, and this is my problem, is there isn't one.
That is the problem.
If I was building an application today and I had free roam to do the best authentication mechanism, I would get as many attributes about the user as I possibly could, everything. And then I would say, look, I've got all this information about you, and I'm using this to build a better profile of you. I know your device, I know your identity attributes, and it's no one single source. You're just going to take as many as possible. My argument would be any one of them alone is a weak attribute. So you know what? Biometrics, keep them. I don't care about that. Give me a hash of your IP. Give me the rough city you're in, and give me the rough time of day you happen to be doing this. I'm going to take lots and lots and lots of weak attributes. I think I could aggregate that up to do a better job of securing it. I don't know how we're addressing that today, because I don't think there's any one solution out there that's doing this. I think we're leaving it to a lot of application developers to mix and match the pieces of authentication they want to do. The real problem there is, as I gather this information, I think Facebook right now is going through a big exercise, and is going to lead a little bit of the light to say, as you gather information from a user, how do you, and this is what you were saying, how do you give them control over that information? And I think back to DNS. DNS, I can own a domain, and I own all my records, but it works. It goes everywhere, but how do we give the same type of functionality to a user?
And what role does regulation play here? And we talk about GDPR, or, you know, right? But so what role is regulation helping in what places, and in what places is regulation missing the mark and diverting our attention from innovation and managing that trade-off?
Well, you know, if you think of, I'm no legal expert, but one of the topics we've talked about AI, we've talked about machine learning. There's also behavior analytics. So if you think of behavior analytics, you know, my example is you're using a mouse, how quickly you use your mouse, how you use it over a 30-day period, how you type on your keyboard over a 30-day period. Perfect way to determine whether it's me or Simon on my account. Because we're different. But from a GDPR perspective, one could say, wow, that's identifying Jackson, and maybe we shouldn't be doing that. And I think it's stuff like AI, machine learning, and behavior analytics that are all those multiple tools we're going to have to use in this long run where, as you said, the user is the perimeter.
It is going to pose a tax on gathering data against users, which creates resolution on the models that we want to act on those threats. So it's like two ends of the spectrum.
It's like the more, because, you know, one of the big things in GDPR is the right to be forgotten, And so the more you have to keep these tethers on those, like whose identity that was, whose PII that was as it moves through your system, that creates a tax. But you're also having to associate it back to a user more often, right? And so
I'm hoping that we can have the same thing for bulk mail to my home. A right to be forgotten.
It's the do not mail list, but it doesn't work.
No, it doesn't work.
Go ahead, Simon.
Sorry, I keep dominating here, but that's a really interesting point. So my belief is regulation never provides answers, but it forces the industry to find a compromise. So, and I think that works not just in our industry, in every industry. Like the airline industry, I don't want to fall out of the plane in a crash. But also, I don't want the plane to cost $100 million, right? There's got to be a balance, right? So there's got to be some sort of give and take. And I think what GDPR is really interesting with the right to be forgotten. What if I open a Bitcoin account and I make some money and I withdraw, but their rules are, the less I know about you, the less I'm going to allow you to trade. And they do that today. Like unless I attach a proper bank account to a certain exchange, I can't trade. So that I want to know you're legit before I allow this to happen. So if I build up a profile with a cryptocurrency exchange, get all my money out, and then disappear and say, forget me, and then I come back to the door and say, oh, Bitcoin's going through the roof. And they're like, no, I don't know who you are. Now the user's being compromised because I don't know anything about you because you wanted to be forgotten. And I'm not saying that the desire of the user is wrong, I'm just saying there's that tension of anonymity versus the output that the user wants. I want you to do this for me, but I don't want you to know me as much as you want to know me to do that thing. That's a hard tension.
One other just item about regulation. I think if written well, regulation protects both the user and commerce. I mean, one of the points of passing legislation is you want to protect an industry so that it can develop and provide services. If people don't trust it or can't use it, or there aren't maybe guardrails around liability, the industry goes away, and that may not be what you want. So I think sometimes we think of regulation as something that's always anti, like business. That's not the case at all. I mean, in the long run, it's a good thing. You want business to develop in a healthy way. So I think it's a little short-sighted to think of, like, if you hear, oh, there's regulation on my industry, that's a bad thing. That's not the case. I mean, if cars were unsafe, like, if cars were built now the way they were, in the 20s, no one would drive them because, death rates were like too high. Obviously, there's some level of protection, and cars are quite popular, right? So I think you have to look at it through that lens.
No, that's good.
I would love to see, though, I'm on the compliance side and part of my job here. I would love to see a convergence of what that looks like, because you've got FedRAMP and GDPR and SOC and
look at the audible
and it's like
churning of stomachs.
Different articles, slightly different for each one of these things that represents compliance, and compliance looks different in how it's measured and obtained. I could argue that GDPR is not defined quite yet because you haven't run a test case yet, but you have to document everything. And so your comment about smart regulation, I think we've got some work to do, and then on how an end user actually gets something done so that it doesn't get in the way of the company's productivity. It's a difficult balance right now.
Yeah, I think that, like you think about like PCI and HIPAA and like compliance and FedRAMP, right? And sometimes regulation can give you a checklist of things you have to do just so you can say you're compliant, and sometimes that's mistaken. Compliance is mistaken as security, right?
Yes.
And then you're not helping, right? GDPR is interesting in some ways. We don't need to talk too much about this, but GDPR is interesting because it kind of says, here's the problem. Your users need a right to be forgotten. Figure it out, right? And it's not necessarily telling you the checklist that you need to have in place, and there's level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's not that. So it'll be interesting to see how that relates to this battle between user control of their identity and their desire for anonymity, I think.
That's good regulation. There's the problem, solve it. That's good regulation. Highlighting problems, having an end goal. He needs to forget his data, go figure it out. And I'm a total fan of that. Like regulations that are, you need to have 256-bit encryption. Boom, out of date by, within...
Don't care how you do it, but just get it.
Just kind of, I want you to protect the user's data, that kind of thing. I mean, if you want to get this back to kind of one of your earlier questions of, so what are we going to do, what's the advice? And one of the things I'm struggling with is... email address is a horrible way to identify somebody. So we're talking about privacy and data, but fake news and fake accounts are constantly kind of dominating the headlines right now. So everybody's allowing people to sign up with an email address. We've got all these technologies that are looking at what type of accounts coming in. Oh, you're coming in from that IP address. I don't want that type of data. Moving, and I work for Twilio, so moving to phone numbers is actually a really healthy transition, because a phone number I can say, an email address is arbitrary. A phone number I can go, right, that's with that carrier. It's this phone number has been created in the last 2 years, so it's got some life to it. It's a residential phone number, not a business phone number. So I get all this data that helps me figure out, is this a legitimate user? Is this a legitimate user returning to the service?
Yeah, that's true.
But I'm now challenged with the other thing we've been talking about is nobody wants to give their phone numbers to a service. Why? Because they're worried about privacy.
Exactly. Yeah, that's interesting.
The thing that complicates that, though, is now you've got virtualized phone services, right? Google and things like that, which are almost as nascent as...
But you can filter that out. Like, there's enough data in the background to say, I don't want a Google Voice. Actually, I'll take a Google Voice number, but I won't take a VoIP number from some random internet company that's just buying up VoIP numbers.
Within a domain, within the U.S. maybe, it's still like you leave the U.S. and that starts to fall apart a little. I mean, it's sort of depending on where you are. So within a domain, it works great. It's just, what do we, and the same comes into the regulation thing. If you can find a way to get kind of a global harmonization, you're way ahead.
That's a great point, because we spend so much time on things that are local. Now, local might be EMEA or local might be North America, but we're not really working on a lot of stuff that's, in quotes, usable globally, right? Even the expectation that somebody has a smartphone and can use your authenticator.
So you're saying we're not
in Mongolia or whatever.
80% of the population actually is it works for
at any time, right? At any given time.
But then one of the biggest markets we're all exploding into, China. I mean, the Chinese app stores are totally different to US app stores. There are limitations on what can be downloaded.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of analysis of the traffic, we all know this, going into and out of those regions. And who's manipulating that data? Are we getting good data in and out?
Right.
It's a big...
So maybe just last question here is, you mentioned how the perimeter has moved or dissipated or moved into the people, right? So are we doing ourselves favors by still talking about the perimeter or not? And if the perimeter is dead in some ways, what does that mean for these like age-old security concepts like defense in depth, right? And how do we need to start changing the way we think about things like that?
Defense in depth to me is now the onion.
Yeah.
It's layer after layer after layer after layer after layer. It just doesn't stop.
Yeah.
I mean, it's user education. It's my wife calling me and saying, should I click on this or not?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a whole level of things now. It's not just the firewall and a couple of other things. It's everything.
I mean, I think that how they are applied changes, but the concept of I have a thing and I want to protect that thing that used to be the corporate network, now it's devices or people or data elements in the cloud. Thinking about that is still exactly the right thing. And defense in depth, don't count on any one thing that someday somebody is going to figure out how to breach.
Absolutely.
That is still absolutely right. So those things are right. We just have to make sure that the way that we apply them doesn't get kind of stuck in time, and then we stop moving forward with, what's the next challenge? We had this great crypto, and then compute time got really cheap, so that didn't work anymore. So we had to do something else. We have to stay in front of it, but all the principles stay. I mean, encryption is still a good thing, even if 56-bit doesn't help us anymore. Right?
Yeah. Brad? I'm curious if you have a perspective there.
Well, it's a riff on your phone number idea. I actually think the thing that's common are MAC addresses and IP addresses, right? And so if we can figure out, and to your point about it's an onion, it absolutely is. If we can figure out a way to re-examine the layers, if you will, and how we treat those layers. Certainly new technologies like AI can apply to the upper layers. Education is one of those things. It's just a redefinition of what works now. I also think that the notion of social is going to be a positive thing. So this diversity in threat detection and capability is going to be a think tank, a contribution thing from a bunch of different capabilities, banking, technology, whatever it happens to be, so we can work collectively to solve the problem.
I think the blockchain answers everything.
Of course it does. Yeah.
Simon, last word, maybe?
I think it's not defense in depth, it's defense going deeper and deeper and deeper.
Yes,
right, it's
that's a great way to put it. Yeah.
Right, the defense in depth was always like, to me, 4 or 5 circles when I ever saw it on somebody's slide.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It's not 4 or 5 circles,
it's infinite.
It's 65,000 shades of grey.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's just so as people that work in the industry, and if somebody's watching this who wants to know, okay, these guys have gabbled on for a bunch of minutes about this problem, what do I do about it?
Yeah.
I think it's on us to do a better job of integrating together and providing simpler and simpler interfaces.
Yes.
Like, I've seen some companies where you start with them and it's just, here's a million things you need to turn to set your security. I'm like, even the smartest of developers is not going to get that.
Yeah.
We need to do a better job of presenting a simpler interface to the security, and we have to find a way to educate and get users to trust us with their information, because if we can't bridge the trust between the user and the business, we're never going to get there.
Yeah, great. Well, hey, thank you guys. Really appreciate you taking the time.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.